get someone to join in, and then we'll start the. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Rahul Verma. I'm a fellow at the Center for Policy Research. Today, we are going to discuss a very, very interesting book, What Millennials Want, written by Vivan Marwaha. And we are joined by a very esteemed set of guests today, Professor Sandeep Shastri, who's Vice Chancellor of Jagran Lake University in Bhopal. Professor Craig Jeffrey, a Professor of Human Geography in University of Australia, Melbourne, and Deepa Bhatia, she's General Manager of YouGov India. And the reason we got these people to talk about this book, because each one of them has been either writing or commenting or part of exercise on reflecting on India's youth. So Sandeep ji has been part of Lokniti CSDS team. He's the national coordinator of Lokniti network. And Lokniti CSDS has been surveying Indian youth since 2007. And if I remember correctly, I was part of 2011 team. Then they did another study in 2016. And it seems that something else is underway by 21-22. We'll have the fourth set of study on Indian youth. So we know a lot about Indian youth from the surveys that has been carried out by Lokniti CSDS. Professor Jeffrey wrote a very, very interesting book. The title of the book is Time Pass, and something, I thought academically only after reading his book, which is Politics of Waiting, and what Indian youth are doing, especially in rural areas. Deepa Bhatia heads YouGov India's operation in India. With YouGov, CPR and Mint has been partners in an exercise for now over 6 waves of surveys on Indian millennials, and these 6 waves have been carried out in last 3-4 years. So we survey every 6 months, and we pick a theme and a topic, and we have been using that data to reflect on Indian millennials, especially in under urban India, because YouGov's panel is largely urban and internet based. So I hope we are going to have a very rich conversation on what this largest sort of generation in the world thinks, what its aspirations and anxieties are. I would request you to keep typing your questions in the Q&A box. I will pick them up and pose them to the panelists. We'll begin with Vivan briefly summarizing the book, presenting the main argument, and then I'll go to our panelists. Vivan, the floor is all yours.
Thanks for having me, Rahul, and a huge thank you to everyone on this panel. Rahul, you and I have discussed my book over the years, and we have had conversations about my research, and I really, a lot of your insights have been valuable to my book. I've of course used YouGov data in a lot of the statements I've made. Professor Jeffrey and I have also emailed over the course of the last few years, and his book is so important to understanding so much of what's happening with Indian youth today, which is time pass and the politics of waiting. And then most importantly, the CSDS Lokniti data. It provides a backbone to my entire book. And my book isn't just about understanding a few people, 5, 7, or even 900 Indians who I interviewed, but this entire generation. And that data set is so crucial for us to do so. Now, about my book, as I mentioned, it combines data along with anecdotes to narrate an intimate biography of India's millennials. And just to put India's millennials into context, that's more than 400 million people, which some people estimate at 440 million, which is basically more than the entire population of the United States and Canada combined. And how well do we know this population? We know that it has a median age of 28, and we know that 2/3 of India's population right now is in the working age of 20 to 35 years. In a lot of ways, India's millennials and India's youth are India's future. And back when I started thinking about my book and its research, I felt that there wasn't a lot of understanding of India's youth beyond what a few organizations were doing. And I wanted to sort of understand it for myself based off of some interactions I'd had. I traveled to Bhopal a lot, Madhya Pradesh, where my grandparents live. And on one of the trips I had over there in 2018, I was talking to my grandmother, who was telling me that her mailman, she had a new courier who kept coming to her house, and she was talking to him one day, and he had a BTech in engineering. And he's someone I actually profile in my book. And I was really wondering, why does someone with a BTech in engineering, why are they delivering mail in Bhopal? And there seems to be something going on over here that we weren't really talking about. At the time, I was working at a really interesting, I had an interesting job at a think tank in Delhi, but we were talking about things like the fourth industrial revolution and AI and machine learning. And I just felt like those weren't relevant to what majority of my generation was experiencing, which was unemployment and the lack of financial stability. And we needed to be having more of those conversations and really understanding how millennials think, how they behave, how they spend their time, and how they spend their money is so crucial to understanding India's future. More importantly, we often talk about this term called the demographic dividend, right? That India's youth, when employed in good paying, stable jobs, will ultimately pay dividends and become nation builders when they're contributing to the economy and when they're consuming goods and services. But how do we actually capitalize on that demographic dividend? How do we capitalize on that dividend when so many of the people who I met in places, not just places in Madhya Pradesh like Jabalpur, but also places in Kerala like Calicut and even Cochin, where there's just such high unemployment? And more importantly, how does that unemployment affect other facets of millennial life? How does that affect marriage or the marriage market? How does that affect politics? And how does it affect the overall life of a millennial in India? So those are some of the questions that I kind of wanted to answer for myself. And I wanted to talk to people who I felt a lot of individuals whom I was interacting with in Delhi and Mumbai were not fully understanding. And at the time, there seemed to be a little bit of a centrism on urban millennials. And I wanted to go beyond that and talk to people in small town India. So the book really is a combination of what I heard in my interviews and in my fieldwork, and with the data set that CSDS Lokniti had conducted, the youth survey, which was released in 2016-17. Just to quickly talk about my findings, and I'd love to dive into these deeper at some later stage as well, is that I found a really interesting paradox in India and among Indian youth. And what I found is that young people are very optimistic about in many ways, about the fate of the country. And they're very optimistic and positive about where the country is headed politically. But they're very pessimistic or anxious and negative about their own lives. And I found this paradox to be very interesting, which also makes sense when you look at what's been happening in India over the last 2 decades, where the economy has grown, but jobs have not grown. And jobs have not grown at pace with the population growth in our country and with the number of individuals we've been adding to the workforce every year. I know those estimates keep varying, but I mean, any trip to a town outside of some of the big cities can tell us that people and labor far exceeds jobs and employment. And so I look at my book sort of gets to the heart of this paradox and the factors that led to it. And my findings were that the first chapter of my book, it deals with the education sector in India and how in a lot of ways, even though most millennials have finished college and university, their education continues to dictate their lives, and in most ways in a negative manner, where families and young people have invested a lot of time and money into their educations, but it has not paid the returns that many people thought it would. Number two is that economic insecurity and the increase in cost of living in India, and this is across big and small cities, is really holding people back. I'd say less than 10% of the people who I interviewed myself were homeowners, and most were living with their families. So that affected a lot of other decisions that they made as well, which includes the third finding in my book, which is about social conservatism in the country, which is rising among millennials, but is not necessarily an independent trend on its own, but is rising because of economic insecurity and because people often have to do not have employment, and they don't have the means to make their own decisions, and have to, which is also why we're seeing the arranged marriage remaining so popular in India today. And then finally, politically, something I found is that the individuals who are promising stability and individuals who are promising or who have profiles that are these, rags to riches stories are performing best in India today. So that's naturally Prime Minister Modi, whose story we've heard about, rising from the son of a tea seller, but also regional leaders like Mamata Banerjee, who've sort of risen up from the streets and speak the language of struggle, and in many ways speak to very common concerns of identity and nationalism or regionalism among Indians, and those are becoming very popular in the country today. So those are some of the top line findings. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation and hearing from everyone else about what they've seen in their research as well.
Great. Thank you, Vivan. Let me ask you two very pointed questions. One, just for the context, and it's not a question, but for the context of the discussion, there is a clear definition people have been using when they call someone millennial, right? So, and yes, you mentioned that in the book, which is people who are born between 1981 and 1996 are called as millennials. So that generation is in 2020 or 2021 is between the ages of 25 and 40. People who were born after 1996, they are called Generation Z, and people before 1981 are pre-millennials. Even there's some distinction between baby boomers and other type of things. So just to keep this, like, the conversation is happening about people today in the age group of 25 and 40. The question, and something which you have mentioned in your book, and we keep referring to this idea of unemployment, and which is sort of shaping everything, the social political context, and especially in rural areas. And in your book, you mentioned that people getting engineering degrees from two-room colleges without teachers just cheating because they didn't get any other job, and students basically enrolling themselves. The question is, and did you manage to dig deeper into this, which is, why are these students even enrolling in those colleges? I can understand from the teacher's point of view that, okay, some job is better than no job. But don't these students realize that this education is not going to give them any job? Why are they enrolling there?
Thanks for the question, and it's something I was answering as well in my book. There's this adage that in India you become an engineer first, and then you figure out what to do with your life. And I think one of the outcomes that so many people are becoming engineers is actually a testament to India's success, that in the decades after independence, a lot of families were able to escape from poverty. And those families then believed they were investing in their children's future. And they said, okay, well, if you are to become successful, you should become an engineer. So a lot of families, and I spoke to some young men and women in Indore, which is, one of the big coaching and education capitals in India today. And I asked, almost all of those students were studying to become engineers. And I asked them, why are you becoming engineers? And they were all from middle-class families. Their parents had either sold some land, or government schemes had sort of, provided a certain level of income and stability to their families, which they were then using to give to their children. Now, these people only knew of engineering as the only ticket out of poverty, or the only ticket to reach the next level of success in India's middle class. There was nothing else that was a demonstrated pathway to get there for many of these families. And I spoke to a teacher at one of those colleges as well, who was only teaching at that college because he had become an engineer and nobody else employed him. And he had actually failed his degree once. And I just found it so interesting that someone who had failed their degree once and couldn't get a job anywhere else is now teaching engineering. So the issue, number one, is that a lot of people are getting engineering degrees because of people being pulled out of poverty, and because there's no other demonstrated pathway for many of these individuals to succeed. But then also we enter a vicious cycle where the quality of those degrees leaves a lot of room to be desired. And so these people then end up becoming couriers, or they try to find odd jobs here and there, or they don't have any work at all. And that's sort of the vicious cycle we're in right now.
Thank you, Vivan. And if I can bring in Sandeep ji here, which is one to reflect on, why are you part of an exercise where you are surveying Indian youth every 5 or 10 years? What are you learning new by these surveys? And two, and especially this joins to Vivan's book. And this is my reading, and I may be wrong on this. It seems that Indian millennials are not any different from other generations. Their aspirations and anxieties are basically determined by their class position, their caste position, their whether they're living in urban or rural areas. Is that so in CSDS data as well? And anything you would like to add on to these two questions?
Thanks, Rahul. Your questions, as always, have caught me in the IPL season like a googly, because I had thought I would not talk about the CSDS studies because Vivan has already discussed that quite extensively in his book. But then quickly, why does Lokniti focus on youth studies at regular intervals? We realize that it gives us an opportunity to tap the nature of change that's happening in the new generation. And it's not that each study confirms what is said in the previous study. There are important lines of departure that we are noticing in some critical areas, which I will refer to. But first, let me compliment Vivan on the very, very fascinating book that he has written, which is interspaced with a lot of anecdotes and also referencing works that are already happened. Now, I would focus on 5 issues in as quick a time as I can. Number one, I think Vivan rightly in his book refers to the education system and how education is not leading to learning. And I believe this is across the board. I did a study in the 1990s of my students. How many of them in a 10-year period have actually done a job relating to what they did their masters in? And my figure showed me that around 20% of my students were actually involved in a profession which was linked to what they studied as part of their education. Once when discussing this at a panel with a director of an IIT, the IIT director in his intervention said, Dr. Shastri, you have a very high percentage of conversions into jobs of people working in the same area. And his point was not even 15% of IIT graduates work in an area which is connected to what they studied in their IIT. So I think irrespective of whether it's a high niche education or a less important education, I mean, less important in terms of what is considered as being not so high profile, there is this challenge of the absence of a relationship between the job and the studies that you do. Beyond a shadow of doubt, as you said, social pressures play an important role. And it's in this context I'm raising the question when the national education policy talks of multiple entries and multiple exits, that you can do 1 year, go out, come back and all that. Will this fit into the Indian social structure, where parents tell the children, complete all your education and then we are there for that and then go and work? So where is this multiple entry and exit going to work? We are trying to bring in if I could use the term, a Western paradigm into our education system, into our socio-cultural context. And I'm not too sure whether that's going to work. Point number 2. Vivans spoke about engineering education. I was part of a project which Wipro led called Mission 10X. I was one of those who formulated that project. And you are right. 4 out of 5 people who entered the 7th semester of their engineering would say that if I had a second choice, I would not be doing engineering. And they realize that in the 7th semester, and it's an 8-semester course. In the 7th semester, you realize I did not want to be here. And we have also found here, as you say in your study, that most people do post-graduation in order to postpone their unemployment, irrespective of sector. Post-graduation is a course you opt for because you want to not remain in the unemployed market. I found Vivan's chapter on islands of California amidst the Sea of Sub-Sahara Africa very interesting. And we have seen that where entering into any of these big campuses, you are in another world. And sorry, I have seen families where parents have never gone to such a world. And when the child comes back home from such a world, there is a disconnect happening in the family. So I think there is something very, very serious and important happening there in terms of the relationship between generations. Let me come to 2 more quick points and then stop what I want to say. Vivan has very, very rightly emphasized this whole question of this focus on government jobs. Security, I would add another point which nobody talks about, non-accountability. As a factor as to why you want a government job, you can't be thrown out, whether you work or you don't. And we found one important point in a study which is not quoted here, which is in Karnataka, when we framed the youth policy, I was asked to chair the committee, we preceded it by a youth survey. And in that, we found something very interesting. The higher the educational attainments of the parents, the less is the aspiration for a government job of the child. That with higher levels of education among the parents, it's not that they don't aspire for a government job, the percentage of those who aspire for it is much less. Let me come to a final point, which Vivan doesn't talk about much in his book, but which we found in our Karnataka study, which is, I think, relevant. This is about how the millennial youth are caught between what we called individual autonomy and group identity. The youth have this unease between retaining their individual autonomy and being part of a group. And if Rahul permits me 1 minute, I'm going to take an example where we used in the youth study, which is this. One day when driving down at midnight from the airport, I suddenly saw 3 motorcycles overtake me. And on that highway, all of them went into a wheelie, all the 3 motorcycles. We saw a wheelie because that highway had no signals at all. Everybody went up on one wheel. My driver and I were quite surprised. We had a free show of a wheelie in front of us for nearly 7 minutes. And then these boys went into a dhaba, which was there at the end of the flyover. And I told my driver I would like to go to the dhaba also. And I went there. And everybody had gone to the restroom. So I was waiting outside the restroom. And when all the boys came out, I went up to one of them who still was in the restroom washing his hands. And I said that wheelie that you all took part in was really lovely. I'm sure you must have been very excited about what you did. He looked around, his friends were not there. He made sure of that first. He looked at me and said, "What do you mean exciting? I never knew that this chap will raise the wheel when I'm driving and when I'm sitting at the back seat. This chap took me on the ride and then suddenly went up on one wheel. What do? I clung to him, much as I would not like to cling to him. I clung to him. What do you mean by it was exciting? Then I said, why do you go with your friend? Why did you join the ride? His answer was where I got my idea from. He said, they're my friends. I can't give them up. I need all of them. So that's when in that Karnataka chapter, we wrote individual autonomy versus group identity. That I think is a major, 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 major challenge, which is patently evident in the millennial generation. Thank you, Rahul, for the time.
Thank you, sir. Now let me invite Deepa and ask her to reflect on two things. One, especially the surveys which we have been part of, focuses on urban youth or urban millennials, and they have greater access to technology, right? And especially the world of social media and other things. And Vivan has a chapter on technology and social media. So the first point is, or the first question is, how is technology shaping up the worldview of these Indian millennials? Is it adding to, of course, of their aspirations because they are connected to the global market? They are seeing a lot of things happening and they want those things happening in India. Is it creating more anxiety? Also in that sense. And the second question is related to much more on the line of, say, gender, right? Like millennial women, are they different from millennial men? What has changed for them and what has not changed for them?
Thank you, Rahul. Both very interesting questions. Second one very close to my heart. So just to give everyone a little bit of a context, because the Mint Millennial Service are a little bit different from the academic work that all of you have worked on and contributed to. It's not a tracker study. We have been doing six waves. We started from 2018. And I'm sorry, I apologize. Mumbai monsoon is making a lot of disturbance at the moment, unseasonally, but so it is. Yeah, so it's our surveys are not trackers in nature, but they're biannual. The idea was to be more frequent and to have a larger number of people have say very frequently on what kind of issues that they're grappling with. The idea was that today there is enough happening within a 6 months period which will impact or create changes in perceptions, in anxieties, and aspirations, and we just want to be on the forefront to try and understand that. Honestly, to be most of our findings are very much in line with even the CSDS youth survey from 2016, as well as what Vivan's written in the book. We see that across the board, unemployment being a key issue. Around only 55% of millennials claim to be in full-term employment. 12% claim to be in under 29 hours a week. Another 7% are employed actually for even less than that, or less than 8 hours. So we not only just see unemployment, even though it's on an online panel, which is usually considered to be that much more affluent. But across India, we see that this issue does resonate. So in terms to come to the first question of their response towards technology, they do end up spending a lot of time online. Their lives are led there, more so with the pandemic. We do see a high uptake in terms of social media. But surprisingly and interestingly, it's not necessarily entertainment that they're talking about. When we ask them, why are you online? What are you planning to do? Usually the reasons are around work or looking for work, or it's so what I'm trying to say is that unemployment issue is so prevalent that what we may think of as time pass for them online, they are actually doing some amount of sort of as well as they can, networking, talking to each other, figuring out where to find jobs, how to find jobs, learning. A lot of time is spent in sort of self-improvement, not even, I would say, not the engineering classes, but how to speak English well classes. And we see a big uptake for that, big demand online for that. YouTube tends to be the number one place they go to, more than Facebook, Instagram, etc. Why? Because education videos are available for free. and they're able to, partake in them. So yeah, in terms of technology, they're definitely adopting it. They're definitely digital savvy. We also see them sometimes use technology, not as high as, let's say, in numbers we've seen from China, but to try and become content creators, because that's also a form of employment for them. Where they, especially before the TikTok ban came across, where we did see a fair number of young, though to be fair, not millennials, the generation Z, trying out to see if that was a viable option for them or not, especially so from tier 2 and 3 cities. Coming now towards gender, it's not necessary that they are different from the millennial men, but we do see very few issues. I mean, they're similarly underemployed, similarly or rather more unemployed. Even within the millennial segment, we see a huge drastic change between, difference between the genders. What I found interesting from the book was about how, we do see millennials as being more conservative, more pro-arranged marriage. What we see from our surveys, though, is that women tend to want to have a voice in choosing their partner, because they realize the impact that partner is going to have on the rest of their lives. And so what we see is overwhelmingly women want to or aim to have a love marriage if they're not already married. Similarly, in terms of the number of children they would have, there is a little bit of a disconnect, where we see women choosing in larger numbers to have one child, while millennial men prefer to have that hum do hamare do kind of a family setup. So what you do see is women starting to want to have that sort of a little bit more urgency of ownership towards their own life. And so they're choosing love marriage through that. They're also hoping, there was an interesting survey we did, I think this was wave 4, and it was around, did people see their lives change versus their parents or their grandparents? Did they see it was improving or, not improving enough? And what I saw was that women tended to feel it had improved a lot because they were comparing themselves to their mothers who did not necessarily have the same agency. And so they scored it higher in terms of, my life is better because of the freedom and opportunities available to me today. And having said all of that, overall, and millennials tended to be happy with their lot. I mean, and now again, I'm saying this is an urban, slightly more affluent online audience. But when compared to, in this survey specifically, when they compared themselves to their parents' lot, they still saw life optimistically. They still felt there was opportunity for them to improve. They were all undersatisfied with the jobs they had if they were working. 75% of the employed wanted to change their jobs, predominantly for better roles, better money. Even within this urban audience, 12% odd wanted government jobs, and most of their motivations, if given a choice between a sort of secure job versus higher earning job, they wanted a secure job. Job that gave them respect was more important than a higher earning job. And it all sort of ties in with the same economic anxiety that we see coming from that sort of unemployment, or rather underemployment as well. Thank you.
Professor Jeffrey, I would basically take you back to the paradox which Vivan mentioned during his opening remarks, which was, at one level, there is a sense of optimism regarding where the country is heading, right? But there is some sort of pessimism about people's own life and economic life and situation. So where is this sort of like paradox coming from, and what does it tell about the future of Indian millennials and India in general? That would be my question one. Second, and it's also like, so far the discussion seems to be not just discussion, but also Vivan's own book and how he starts, and even your own work, it's basically shaped up, and of course they are youth, and that's why perhaps like education and employment concerns. as if those are the only two factors and variables shaping up what millennials think and what they want. Whether a upper caste youth living in rural India has similar aspirations and anxieties versus a Dalit, I'm not too sure, right? Their aspirations and anxieties, I would expect, are going to be very, very different, right? And so there is less discussion of that. What do you think on these two questions? And we can then bring in other points in the second round.
Thanks very much, Rahul, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in the panel. It's very, very nice to be alongside such an esteemed panel. Deepa, it's fascinating to hear about your work. And Professor Shastri, I've benefited so much from the CSDS Lokniti surveys over the years. So congratulations on all of your work, which is tremendously helpful. And last but not least, Vivan, you've written such a tremendous book. Congratulations. I think it's going to be a real hit. And anyone who's listening to this who hasn't already read it, please, rush to the booksellers or get it online, because it really is a fantastic read. In terms of your first question, Rahul, I guess one of the things I was thinking when I was reading Vivan's book was, how specific is any of this to India? Because a lot of what you're describing, Vivan, in terms of the insecurities and concerns of millennials are the insecurities and concerns of that generation in the UK, in America, in Colombia, in South Africa, in Ethiopia, in Australia, in Papua New Guinea. These are very, very general concerns. Education, the quality of education, and the quality of and availability of employment. And to get to your question, Rahul, I think infrastructure, housing, Vivan's mentioned, is another key issue. And of course, the environment, climate change, questions around the suitability of the political systems in which people operate to represent young people's views and ambitions. So I think there's a lot of commonalities across national boundaries. So my first question to Vivan would be, what is specific or specifically interesting about India and about Indian millennials? And I know you haven't had the opportunity yet. I hope you do this, to travel to other countries to interview millennials. I think it would be great to do that. But that would be, and I guess it's a question for the whole panel. And then on the paradox, and I guess this gets to my second question for Vivan. Now, I think that, I worry that you overdo the conservatism. And Deepa mentioned young women and the ways in which they're challenging different types of conservative values in India. I think that's a fantastic point, and it ties in with my own research recently with Associate Professor Jane Dyson in Uttarakhand, on very much based on ethnographic qualitative research rather than surveys, but showing very much that young women, both in both millennials and Generation Z, are very involved in challenging aspects of rural patriarchy. So I wonder whether the conservatism is a little bit gendered. But even sticking with men, I think one of the wonderful things about working with young people in India or in any other part of the world is that they are challenging many stereotypes. They do have a kind of, as Karl Mannheim, the philosopher, the sociologist said, they have a kind of fresh contact with their inherited social and environmental setting. And of course, we mustn't romanticize. And of course, all the points you're making in your book are absolutely valid. But I do think there's another story to tell about young people, not as an economic dividend for their country, but as a social dividend. And that was part of the original writing on demographic dividend, was not just about young people's economic contribution to the country, but their contribution to changing how countries might think about themselves and think about issues of rights and citizenship. And that's, I think, really important. So those are my two main questions, was India and the wider world, and what about some of that positive youth action? But I would just make a third point, which, but just because it's been discussed quite a bit in the panel, and it ties in with some things that Professor Shastri said. I don't think we should overplay the distinction between government employment and private employment, because actually a lot of the work that the young people that you're interviewing are doing is actually happening in the interstices of the private and the public. And let me just finish with my own anecdote, which is taken from my book, Time Pass, which is that, you know, a lot of the young people who were not able to obtain secure government employment and who'd spent long periods of time accumulating degrees and applying for government jobs, they actually became involved in the private educational market, in the running of coaching institutes, in the running of personality centers, in training other people to do government job interviews. They became, in fact, they worked in this kind of precise nexus between the private and the public. And in a sense, they recreated the system that had created them as educated, underemployed young people. And so, you know, one of the people I got to know very well, he spent many, many years trying to get a job as an officer in the Indian Army. And his friends, very cruelly, they promoted him by one rank in the army every time he was unsuccessful. So I think he was Brigadier Rajesh Singh after a few years. But this brigadier, you know, in name only, when he'd finished his efforts to try to become an officer in the Indian Army and was unsuccessful, he set up a business training other youth in how to apply to be an officer in the Indian Army. So, you know, we need to be aware of these kinds of feedback loops, and also be wary of, well, I think sort of actually delve into that kind of whole world, murky world that you describe so beautifully in the book, to look at how people are finding these niches within this complex kind of ecosystem connecting the state and the non-state that actually provides access to money and a measure of security. So that's all I wanted to say. I hope it's helpful. And again, you know, congratulations on the book, and look forward to future conversations and the next book.
Thank you, Professor Jeffrey. So Vivan, before you respond to some of the comments that has been made by Professor Jeffrey, Sandeep ji, and Deepa, let me add one more question from your book. And this is, if I remember the name of this character correctly, there is a basically description about Radhe and his wife, Radhe, who lost his job, and you know, and he's earning 5,000, and the wife is a private librarian in a private school, and she earns 12,000. What I was struck by, like one comment in your book, is the wife earns because the husband doesn't make enough money, right? And it struck me because, especially like what Deepa pointed out, right, is that something has changed in last 20, 30 years. Now, why should Radhe or you be so surprised wife making more money? Is it good, bad? In some ways, like Radhe not having you know, stable job is allowing or creating space for women to come into the picture and perhaps earning equally or earning more, right? So I wasn't sure like what that concluding line meant in that sense. It was a comment on Radhe or the changing social structure, and of course, like you know, I'm like, what did you notice on the caste front, right? Like, how was a Dalit thinking about, like, it's like, what are their aspirations and anxieties? And I'm somehow not very convinced with, like, of course, employment and education is important, but like political sort of things were sort of missing for me. Perhaps it's not in the book, and you might be able to articulate a little more in your response.
Is there anything else, or can I start?
No, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So thanks everyone for the comments. I think many of them actually weave into each other. So I'll start with something Sandeep ji said, which also ties into something Dr. Jeffrey mentioned. And Sandeep ji made a comment about group identity. And I found it really interesting, the anecdote he shared, because somebody I met this year, they're not in the book, I met them once it was done. She's a woman who's a member of a cult or a religious sect in Haryana, which was raided by the authorities a few years ago because of some crimes that had taken place at the ashram. And she was still devoted to its leader. And I asked her, you're a woman, why are you so devoted to this ashram? Why are you so behind its leader? And what she basically told me is that the ashram is the only place where she feels safe. In her village, she doesn't really have the space, or she doesn't really have the autonomy to have interactions with other men and to have interactions with other women, and definitely any men her age. But when she tells her family, "Main to ashram ja rahi hu," when I go to the ashram, nobody can question that because she's going to the ashram. And now when she's at the ashram, she has a space and the security to talk to other young men and women her age and to have those conversations that young people around the world take for granted. Therein, we find something about group identity, and we talk a lot about the rise of religion in India today. But it's really interesting because it's so tied into the identity that religion provides so many young Indians, that I am a follower of ABC person. Liberalism or secularism doesn't necessarily provide that identity. Now, it also goes to something Dr. Jeffrey had mentioned, in that many of these factors exist around the world. Why is India different? Why I believe India is different is because, well, there's sheer numbers, right? Millennials over here outnumber, I think, all of the millennials in the Americas combined, both of North and South America put together. But the way it plays out into millennial life, in the US, where I was living right before coming back for the book, you do not have 6.5 or 7 out of 10 millennials telling you that they want a government job. And a government job is the #1 priority in life. And this is any millennial, no matter how long they've been looking for work. Similarly, you don't have 84% of American millennials telling you that they're going to have an arranged marriage. But we see those numbers in India, right? Those are unique to India. So the reason why I find this interesting is that, yes, around the world, and I mentioned this a little bit in the book, but I don't dive into it, is that we are seeing some of these conditions around the world, but I think they're playing out very differently in India. I write about Spain a little bit, I think just a few sentences, where there were riots and protests because of the unemployment over there. We have similar unemployment in India, but we don't see any unemployment riots or protests, right? Why is that? And again, that's something unique to the Indian context, where formal jobs have never actually been a part of life, or have not really been a construct that people really take for granted, because formal jobs have largely been restricted to the services sector in the 4 or 5 big cities in this country. It's another reason I find it interesting. I do believe that young women are, in many respects, I met a lot of young women who were challenging the system, and they were sort of breaking out from that, the existing paradigm. But I also met a lot of young women who were actually more conservative than young men. And I met a lot of young women who would tell me, someone who actually works at an H&M in Delhi, she told me, "I'm not a feminist. Main to feminist nahi hu," loudly, and went on to, she has a job, but she says, in a few years after I have a child, I'm naturally going to give up my job, and I'm going to, I'm obviously not going to do anything different. And so I think the jury is still a little bit out on that. I can speak to the work I've done, and in my interviews, I did find more young women who were more traditional in a sense, or conservative, than I met the people who were challenging the system. And I guess that's also because of the cost of challenging the system, which once again, I write in the book. I talk about an honor killing that didn't take place in North India, but it took place in Kerala, and it took place among the Christian community of a young man named Kevin, who was a Dalit Christian. And he was engaged to, or he fell in love with a Syrian Christian girl who in the hierarchy is above Dalit Christians. And Kevin was murdered by the girl's family. And a lot of people don't know this, but in the girl's family, the Syrian Christian family, her mother was actually a Muslim. She was a Malayali Muslim, but she was upper class. And she also, I think, came from an upper caste background within that community itself. And so it was interesting because you have a Keralite Christian father and a Malayali Muslim mother who sort of engaged in this because, you know, their daughter marrying a Dalit was so outside of what would be considered acceptable. And going to, you know, Rahul, what you had said about caste and what Deepa ji had spoken about technology, I found that technology has been, you know, contrary to what some people say, this amazing equalizer and provider of access and opportunity to minorities, to Dalits, to Muslims, and to women, because they're able to have these amazing conversations online that they can't really have in real life, that they can't really have where physical spaces are closed off to them. And they're also able to access opportunities where they weren't available earlier. I write about someone named Sumit Samos, who I met a few years ago on a television show. And he is basically a Dalit rapper. He started uploading his videos in 2016 after the suicide of Rohit Vemula in Hyderabad. And he became a bit of a sensation. He was invited to Paris and to Mauritius. I met him on Barkhadat's show where he'd been invited to rap. And and since then, he got into Oxford for his master's, but he didn't get a scholarship. So he crowdfunded it. And he raised almost 50 lakhs. That's about, you know, 80,000 pounds online, and crowdfunded his master's at Oxford. And he's headed to Oxford this week. And this entirely happened online. It entirely happened because of social media. And I don't think, you know, this story would have been possible 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, that, you know, this you know, young Dalit man had all of these opportunities. And he's obviously just one person I'm talking about, but there are many more such stories that exist in the country today. And so, you know, I hope I've addressed everyone's concerns. Rahul, you did mention something about politics. I didn't fully catch that. So please do let me know if I haven't addressed that yet.
No worries, Vivan, I'll come back to you on that. So we can do two things, as we have, you know, people can either type their questions in the Q&A box and I can frame them and ask the panelists. The second way is, Ilika, if you can allow me to become a co-host, and then I can, you know, people can raise their hands and directly ask the questions to panelists. So I'm open to both the things. So I am now co-host. If people can just raise hand using the raise hand button, I will allow them to talk. Anyone, any question? No, I think so. So before, like, while people type their questions and other things, let me sort of get back to the question I posed this to Professor Jeffrey also in some ways, and now Vivan in his answers brought this back, which is, why are we not seeing Indian youth or Indian millennials on the street protesting? They're not getting jobs. Why aren't we seeing them, you know, creating riot-like situations? So are Indian millennials, Professor Jeffrey, any different from millennials in other parts? What is, like, why are they peaceful, or there are some systematic factors which is keeping them away from the streets?
Well, I think it's the $64,000 question. It's a very interesting one. And, you know, what actually explains the amount of hope in India is, I think, really a very complex question. I mean, part of the answer, I guess, lies in the electoral system and the capacity to vote and the competitive democracy. I think part of the answer lies in the nature of the hardship that we're discussing, because I think that when you don't get that coveted job, you imagine it as a personal failure. You don't necessarily connect it to structural issues. I think it has partly to do with that whole penumbra of institutions and arrangements that Vivans has in the book, and which I just mentioned, around the kind of cultural production of hope at the everyday level in India, which is a business, which is, you just polish your CV a little bit more, learn to speak English a little bit better, just get this extra credential and things will work out. So one of the reasons why there isn't more protest is because of kind of versions of time pass, I guess, that, you don't realize all this all at once. And there's always hope. There's always the possibility that things will change. I know, sorry, it's probably a bit of a silly answer, but I think it's a very, very interesting question.
No, I'm just trying to, Professor Shastri.
To just add to what Professor Jeffrey said, our last youth study found something very interesting. Among the youth, the membership of organizations and associations, farmers, youth, and all that, then the percentage of membership among youth is increased quite significantly. More youth are members of such organizations. But that does not translate itself into participation in protests and participation in street level activities of this youth. So it's not that they are not engaged with these organizations, but when it comes to their own participation in the street, in a protest or in any organized way, that's something that they desist from taking part in. And maybe that's not just the youth. This is also true of the larger segment of the population in the country. What I have said just now about the youth is also true of older people. You may have a larger number of them associated with organizations, but then do not think it's prudent to come out in the street and participate in a protest.
Deepa, if I can bring you in here, Vivan, there are some questions coming on Q&A box. You can read them and answer them after this, which is the survey you have been quoting and citing is largely urban based, whereas Vivan argues that in his interviews of 900 people, he sees more traditional or conservative element, so people are more towards the conservative and traditional element, whereas you are pointing out that there are some changes on the status quo, and especially among young women. And something, if you remember, I may have pointed out this during our conversations when we talked about the question and questionnaire designing. That, in some senses, Indian millennials, especially the men, are getting beaten twice. Once in the outside market of education and employment, where there is not enough opportunities and they are basically, are taking a backseat there. And once they come home, compared to their father's generation, when perhaps women were sort of more husband worshipping or something like that, please pardon my language there. I think now, as you pointed out, women are a little bit more assertive, right? They have higher, a little better on education, some financial independence. So how are Indian men then reacting if they're getting beaten outside and also in the home getting challenged?
So it's a very interesting question. I'm not sure we've done surveys to address it exactly. So please forgive me if a lot of it is somehow my hypothesis. But I think a lot of and it's partially related to, I wanted to actually chime in on the question of why they're not protesting. And I wanted to actually highlight that it's not always been a jobless growth scenario in this country. I mean, about a decade or so ago, we suddenly did go through this economic upswing, and I think what ended up happening was that a lot of people saw, if not themselves improve, or maybe their parents or slightly older brothers, etc., improve, and therefore there is some reason for their hope to still, be alive in some form. And related to that, to the gender question, what we did see is over the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of emphasis on enrolling women into schools. State governments, some state governments have done a fantastic job, some maybe not so much, but what we did see, the impact of that is that if you've seen the news lately, almost regularly you see women topping board exams. It's become normal. It wasn't so when I was a student. So those changes have taken place where we see higher enrollments in school. We do still see some of them drop off, but we do also see women trying to, sort of come in and use education as that ladder, and therefore bring a lot more competition in a sense there. They all join jobs? No, unfortunately they don't. We don't see necessarily that, that they all even seek jobs, but they do definitely seek education. And maybe as part of that education, some amount of empowerment has started seeping in. And I'm not trying to challenge to say that they don't want to get married and have children and, be part of the system that they've seen. They just want to have more voice. And we see that across the board. They do want to have, we see that they want to have a bit of financial independence. They do wish to have a little bit more voice in terms of how their children will be educated in the future, where they'll go, what they'll do. They just want to have a little bit more voice in terms of the kind of partner they choose. What we see when we ask questions around, marriage to women, marriage between caste, intercaste, interreligion, language, is it different or not? What we actually see is that the highest numbers come to, I want to marry someone in my socioeconomic class. So they're very economic being at the moment. And they're using that, I think, for creating some room for their own empowerment. For men, honestly, we've not studied how they're feeling about it, but I do feel they are feeling a little bit left out. If that is the right thing to say. I don't think it's out of that they are extremely conservative in their views or they're extremely religious. They're not. They're seeing that they do not necessarily, when asked about religion, it does not come in their top interest, so to speak. They don't even see religion as a top sort of social support system. They see family as number one, very dominantly. And then it's work and everything else. Religion comes, if out of 7 choices, maybe 5th or 6th. They don't actively necessarily go to temples as often as we think that they would. They don't worship formally, let's say, as much as we think about it. But within that sort of space, they have views where they're not. So what I'm trying to say is that they're not necessarily holding these views very dear, and it's not emanating from some strong belief in where women should be, should we be having an intercaste marriage? Should we be having a, is eating beef right or wrong? I think all of it is actually a narrative they're probably borrowing because they haven't thought very deeply about. And they're probably borrowing because a huge chunk of their social support is actually authority at the moment. That authority is not necessarily only held by government, but by their parents, their support system, their families, their community. The number of people who are getting employed, by community members, and you see that there is incentive to conform. And so if there's a way, I would say, they're not necessarily extremely conservative in their viewpoints. They're not feeling left out because of that, but they haven't thought very deeply about the other, so to speak. Okay. And,
Okay. Vivan, sorry, Deepa, do you have anything? Okay. Vivan, before I come to you, something that Deepa said, I would like to put that to Professor Shastri, and you can also chime in once he is completed. So Deepa basically mentioned that they are like, Indian millennials are not very religious. They are not going to temples or, participating in these things, which is perplexing. If you're not getting jobs, if you're not getting good degrees, you should be praying little more, right? That's the first thing. Second is we know that religiosity in India is going up in last 4 or 5 decades. So if Indian millennials are not praying, who's praying, Professor Shastri? People of your generation? What's happening on the religiosity front?
If you look at, of course, Deepa has added a caveat to her study that it is urban youth. If you look at the studies that Lokniti has done with regard to youth, I think the sentiments that youth have expressed with regard to religion and religion-related issues continue to be as intense as those expressed by older generations. Be it the response to questions like their attitude towards the other religious groups, or questions like banning of movies which hurt religious sentiments, or questions like the whole debate on consumption of a particular type of meat. On all these questions, if you look at what our last survey said with regard to the youth, I think the attitudes were as intense as those of the older generations. So I don't think we are seeing any reduced religiosity or religious sentiment among the youth, at least from the Lokniti studies. That does not seem to be emerging. And we are looking forward to our next study to find out whether there's been any change on that in the recent past.
Okay, thank you. Vivan, the 2 questions on the chat box, and people please keep adding questions and anything you would like to add.
Yeah, I'll talk about what we were just discussing and then also answer the questions in the chat box because they're very interesting. I want to echo everything Sandeep ji and Deepa ji just said, in that in a lot of ways, these attitudes are similar to those of older generations, and particularly a point that Deepa ji had mentioned about there not being a lot of very deep thought placed into some of these answers. And I would talk to a lot of young people and I'd ask them the basic sort of fishing question, should beef be banned? And a lot of people, most people would say, yeah, beef should be banned. And I'd say, why? And they're like, well, obviously, you know, beef should be banned. It's like, it's sacred or whatever. Then I said, well, you know, India is technically a secular country and Muslims consider pork sacred. So should pork be banned? Then I said, well, you know, Jains consider all animals sacred. Should, you know, the country become vegetarian? And this community does not even eat onion or garlic. Should we ban onion or garlic, right? Because in a secular country, you can't ban what one community wants without banning what the others want. And when this was sort of placed in front of some of my respondents, which I only had time to do in my longer interviews, then there was like, oh, okay, you know, I hadn't thought about that. But then they went back to their initial position that beef should be banned, because, you know, it's what the majority of the country believes. And that's why, you know, we should go on with the will of that majority. Deepa ji had also mentioned how a lot of young people might not go to temples or they might not pray regularly. And the CSDS study actually finds that. And these numbers are on page 130 and 131 of my book, where I talk about how a lot of young Indians are actually, they say they're religious, but when you actually talk to them and dive further into what makes them religious, it's not that these people are visiting places of worship or that they're praying regularly. It's just that they're saying they're religious. One very interesting finding so Pew found that 80% of the people they surveyed in India said religion was very important in their lives, which is higher than the number for Iran, which is a theocratic state, which was at 78%. But then the CSDS survey, when they asked their respondents whether they preferred religion to science, 47% said yes. And when you broke that number down, more educated young Indians said that religion should take precedence over science over less educated people, Indians. And, you know, I just found that to be an interesting finding, which I also was seeing in my own field work. Something that Tom Wilkinson had asked is, what trends do you see with regards to millennial participation in social service movements or movements in general? And do they want to get involved? And we had touched upon this earlier in the context of employment, but I was also asked this question on another show I was doing with Barkha Dutt, and she was talking about how Gen Z was very active in the CAA protests. And I think one thing we have to understand is that protests in Delhi or Bombay by students at JNU or Jamia or Xavier's are not reflective of a majority of the youth. And we have to understand that justice or religious rights in India do not really matter to a lot of people. They don't matter for a variety of reasons, at least in what I have found. I was in Bhopal, where during the Lok Sabha elections in 2019, where Sadhvi Pragya had been nominated. And I asked a lot of people, Hindus and Muslims, who they were going to vote for. And there was a lot of polarization. And I asked a lot of moderate Hindus, who were traditional BJP voters. And they said, yeah, we're going to vote for her. Because we want the BJP back at the central government. But also a lot of people weren't really bothered about her past and about what she had done prior to her nomination. And just generally what I found is that there are more pressing economic concerns that people are dealing with, but that issues of religious rights for other communities are not as important as religious rights for your own community. And there's a team of researchers led by Sudha Pai. They had a study called Everyday Communalism. And they found that in UP, in Uttar Pradesh, some organizations affiliated with the ruling party had undertaken decades worth of drip, like small scale communalism, small scale riots, small scale incidents, to basically build a narrative of Hinduism under attack. And that narrative was a very compelling one. And a lot of youth had sort of bought into that narrative. So it's often not religious rights for another community, but for your own community, and that your own community, which may be the majority community, is under attack, and you have to do everything you can to protect it. There was another question about arranged marriage and whether choosing one is a strategic choice. And a lot of cases, it is a strategic choice, but I write about someone who is from a family in Jaipur, from a professional background. His sister had had a love marriage. She picked an arranged marriage because, like the question itself alludes to, she believed her match would be better. But she found herself in a situation where she's a middle-class person, she has her own job, but she does not have equality in her household. She and her husband, they both come back home at say 7 or 7:30 p.m. And while he goes and lies on the bed to watch Netflix, she's in the kitchen with her mother-in-law and her other sister-in-law cooking food. She wakes up an hour before he does to make breakfast for him. And she told me in a lot of ways, like, I don't necessarily mind doing this, but it's taken for granted. And that is what she objected to, that why is my work, why is this extra work that I'm doing on top of my regular job, why is it taken for granted? And why is he never expected to do any of this? And that interview was an interesting one. It left me very depressed, to be honest, about what was going on, because as the interview she kept opening up to me, she seemed more and more disillusioned with her marriage and with her arranged marriage and with her situation. And it's something that, yes, in certain in certain situations linked to economics, people have more leeway of choosing within the arranged marriage system. But I've also met a lot of people who were told, this is the boy you're going to marry, this is the girl you're going to marry, and you're going to marry them. And that has not changed for a lot of people. I don't know an exact number itself from the interviews I did, but it was a substantial enough number.
Okay, thank you, Vivan. Professor Jeffrey, people please keep putting your questions. Professor Jeffrey, I would like to basically bring you here on the conversation you were having with my colleague Priyadarshini on strategic conservatism, and Vivan also touched on this. The question which I have is, so has the project of modernization, or what we expected modernity to do, has failed, or has just a limited potential in terms of like basically changing views on religion, changing views on partners, what kind of freedom of expression and speech. As Vivan also pointed out, you care about your own group's right, but not others. So, sense, the modernization thesis expected that there would be development of more liberal norms with advent of technology and other things. So in that sense, if that's not happening, is then the project of liberalism, to extend this point, will remain under stress? Because youth are not going to be the vanguard of that project of liberalism.
Well, Vivan has given me the perfect excuse to give the academic answer to this, because Vivan, you mentioned in your book that every truism about India can be countered with another truism. And Joan Robinson famously said, anything that can be rightly said about India, the opposite is also true. So, I mean, on the modernization question, Rahul, I mean, I think I'm broadly in agreement with Vivan that, the modernization, if you read it in a sociology textbook of the 1960s, hasn't occurred in India in the way that people imagined. I mean, Nehru imagined that religion would become less popular in India. I mean, and reservations would no longer be required very soon because caste would cease to be a relevant identity. And in relation to marriage, I mean, all that Vivan writes, is absolutely right. That there hasn't been the kind of modernization that certain people might have expected. But the opposite is also true, and I think that there are ways in which modernization has, and I mean, I don't know if modernization is the right term, but people's sort of growing enrollment in forms of liberal democracy has, I think, created something I've written about called a social revolution in India, which I don't see fully reflected in Vivan's book, and I don't know why, and I think it's probably to do with methodology or something, or maybe I'm wrong, but and that social revolution has been about greater access to communication technologies, greater access to education, people absorbing notions of liberal democracy and rights, and I think that it's also reflected in a whole substratum of behavior of young people that you see at the everyday level. And it might be helping a nephew to get access to a school, or helping an elderly aunt to get access to medical care. It might be complaining about a contractor who's skimming off money and going to the district magistrate and complaining about it. I think all that kind of activity is really important to enter into the equation.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Shastri. And now we have just like 10 minutes left. So each one of you can take 2 minutes to basically make your final comments as well.
I would just like to make one point to carry forward the discussion which Professor Jeffrey just now started. I'm going to just share 3 data points on this question of response to marriage from our last study. Data point number 1, how important is marriage as an institution? There is a decline from 80% to 52% saying it's important. In the earlier study, 80% said marriage as an institution is important. That has declined to 52% now among the youths. Secondly, 55% of the youth said intercaste marriages are okay. However, 84% of them themselves had an arranged marriage. So while it's okay for people to have an intercaste marriage, but when it comes to me, 84% said arranged marriage, and 90% plus of those arranged marriages were within the caste. So I just thought I would provide this small input with regard to the discussion we are having.
Deepa and Vivan, and if anyone else also wants to join this, and this is my last question, everyone can reflect on this, which is, given that millennials are not any different from the previous generation on the question of conservatism, liberalism, aspirations, anxieties, and even if technology has come in, of course, there are like smaller changes that are taking place. Gen Z is also not going to be very different. They will look. So in that sense, should we be hopeful about the future of India, or like there are going to be some new and interesting things happening, or it will be life as usual? So all the terms of demographic dividend, all kinds of dividends, we should just keep it aside. We are not going to get any positive dividend as such. It would be basically, just status quo as usual with small tinkering here and there.
Maybe with all the work on the youth, I am more optimistic. But I don't see as that even the project, like what you asked, Professor Jeffrey, I don't see that project as having failed necessarily. I think that we are a country in flux. And transformation will not follow that linear line that we are hoping to see across all domains. We will start seeing changes in some attitudes, like Professor Shastri said about, like marriage as an institution's importance is decreasing, right? But yet they're still getting arranged marriage. So I do think that kind of change is just going to take longer in a country like India than maybe what all of us hoped for or expected. But I feel like there will always be change, because at the end of the day, and that's something what Vivan sort of mentioned, and I really genuinely believe, more than millennials or not, he referenced a tweet by Nitin Pai who said that, there are these generations like Doordarshan, AIR, Midnight's Children, etc. I do believe that all of us are, at the end of the day, socioeconomic animals and don't realize what opportunities and what affects us and what impacts our choices. Those choices are going to be different for different generations, but not necessarily as linear as we believe them to be. It won't be because I was born in 1980. It might be because I benefited from liberalism, liberalization in India. Similarly, the generation that experiences demonetization and today's work may change in a very different way. So I think our work will always remain extremely, extremely interesting, no matter which way the wind blows. I feel personally very hopeful that wind eventually, because globally that wind will take us a little bit forward, I think, in the liberal project overall, if not necessarily completely the way the West defines it, but more because Indians at heart genuinely want to be accepted by the world, celebrated by the world. It seems to be ingrained in our DNA for some reason. And so if only for that, we'll probably change it.
Vivan, I'll give you the last word and we'll close after you. But I'll just join that point which Deepa made, quoting Nitin Pai's tweet about dividing the generation. The last two generations which Nitin Pai mentioned, and especially the last generation, is #brats.
Yeah.
Which in some ways, if you're thinking of a generation, and from it seems like every generation thinks of the next generation, that they are not going to do anything useful, basically destroy whatever we have created. So our next generation is seen as brats, only spending time on Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok, and I don't even know the new things that are coming up. Are you hopeful like Deepa, or you have some concerns?
The Indian TikTok is Moj, which is an entire copy basically of TikTok. I just quickly want to jump off what Professor Jeffrey said and then get to your question about liberal democracy. And if I got the question right, we've always had high electoral participation in India. That's not entirely new. People have always participated in voting. One thing I think that is unique to my generation, to millennials in India, is that there's actually, what I found is that there's less faith in liberal democracy delivering economic change and better living conditions than I would say other generations have had. Or you could compare Modi in a lot of ways to Indira Gandhi, and they had similar tendencies in how they function. In that, maybe this is not unique and this is the same, but I did feel that a lot of people, or I heard actually that a lot of the people I was meeting were telling me, we like Modi because he's a strong man, because he's an authoritarian, because he gets things done unilaterally. And that is actually the opposite of what a liberal democracy tends to usually deliver. And even India's highest periods of economic growth, data has found took place under coalition governments, which are the definition of liberal democracies in many places, as opposed to a lot of the decision making that we've seen recently in India, which is why I didn't mention what Professor Jeffrey had really spoken about, because I found that in some ways young people in India were a little counterintuitively, answering the liberal democracy question in their support for people who do not necessarily embody those values. But my view on where we're headed is, I am more hopeful because there are, regardless of the very difficult economic conditions of the people I was talking to, there was still a lot of hope about the future of the country. And also about, many people believe like, okay, I have a really bad day today, but tomorrow could be better, and tomorrow will be better for my children. And in a lot of ways that's tragic, because today's children, millennials today, were largely born around the time of liberalization, a few years before and a few years after. The country was opening up, wealth was flowing in, and you would expect the liberalization and the evaporation of socialism at a structure level to have created a huge churn and a huge boom in those opportunities, which didn't necessarily happen. We could be seeing that now, with Gen Z. There's a lot of, the reason why there's so many engineers in India is because engineers were so successful in creating wealth. Well, now you have entrepreneurs who are successful in creating wealth. India has the highest number of unicorns across the world, Cred, Paytm, Byju's, all of these companies, and they're all self-made, very middle-class type of people who founded them. So that could create, a new culture of innovation among our young people, that taking those risks and quitting a good job, or, starting something, Ritesh Agarwal, the Oyo Rooms guy, didn't even have a college education. And his idea is not like, he hasn't copied any company. It's a unique idea, and he's done exceedingly well for himself. Bhavish Agarwal at Ola quit a job at Microsoft to start what his dad called a taxi company. And if we can replicate many more of those stories, if we can get that culture of entrepreneurship to really, permeate further, that could be something really interesting, combined with a lot of the insights from Dr. Jeffrey's fieldwork, where time pass on its own can also be valuable, because you are productive and you are doing certain things that don't necessarily have no economic value. So I do think the fact that people are still optimistic broadly about the country can lead us also to be optimistic, and that with the right level of economic growth, we can see every ship sort of, there's a saying, I can't remember the exact saying, but all boats get lifted as the waters rise. So hopefully something like that occurs in the next 5-10 years, where the outlook changes.
Great. Thank you, Vivan, for ending on such a positive note. I'm also hopeful about things, but my role was to play a devil's advocate. Thank you, everyone, for joining today, especially Lokniti CSDS, CPR, and Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for continuously supporting our research here at CPR. Thank you, Professor Jeffrey, Sandeep ji, and Deepa, and Vivan. Great book again. We'll talk more soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.